I'm going to set a timer for myself. For those of you who don't know, historians are notorious for going over time. So just to let you know, I have 8 pages and I have 10 minutes. But I just wanted to make one quick thing for my students who are in my 101 class. You're supposed to be taking notes right now. So hopefully you got that message. Okay. Man, this whole experience has been incredibly difficult for me. I live in Ferguson. I grew up in Ferguson. I grew up in North County. I still live there today. I bought a house in Ferguson because I wanted to live in a racially diverse area. And I have to be honest with you, I was really nervous about doing this presentation today just because it's been such a stressful situation. So I'm going to do my best to provide a context, because one of the things that I keep hearing over and over again is that this isn't about race. No, it's a cop doing his job. You know, there's no racial motivation in there. We should not consider race. And all I have to say is, you're absolutely naive if you think this is not about race. There's a strong history of racism in St. Louis and in Ferguson, and I'm going to provide some of the context for that. So I want to read you a newspaper article, all right? And then we're going to ask you a couple questions about it afterwards. It says, for an hour and a half last evening, I saw the massacre of helpless Negroes at Broadway and 4th Street in downtown East St. Louis, where a black skin was a death warrant. I saw man after man with his hands raised, pleading for his life, surrounded by groups of men who knew nothing about him except that he was black, and saw them administer the historic sentence of intolerance, death by stoning. I saw Negro women begging for mercy, set upon by a white woman, who laughed and answered the coarse sallies of the men as they beat the negress' faces and breasts with stones and sticks. It was not my idea of a mob. The East St. Louis affair, as I saw it, was a manhunt. There was no crowd of hot-headed youths. Younger men were in greater number, but they were middle-aged, no less active in destroying every discoverable black man. Get the N-word was the slogan, and it was varied by the recurrent cry of get another. So when I read that to you, it's a weird newspaper report. I was struck when I read it with how similar it sounds to the newspaper reports I've heard discussing the Mike Brown affair. But this article was written by a white reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1917, 100 years earlier than the Mike Brown affair. I was particularly struck with the line that says, I saw man after man with his hands raised pleading for his life, and still the death sentence was administered. Different circumstances. This newspaper article is describing a race riot that happened in East St. Louis in 1917, but it demonstrates very clearly a long, well-documented history of racial discrimination in St. Louis and Ferguson, and I'm going to provide more of that context. So there are so many similarities between that, and one of the things that I've been struck with the most in living in Ferguson, I think the thing that's been most disturbing to me, is how much the words that I hear people say sound like 1917, 1968. Words that I thought were erased from American memory as just a dirty memory being thrown around casually by people on Facebook, on Twitter. I don't know if you guys saw the video of the protesters at the Cardinals game. That is bad. That's racism. And racism has been an undercurrent. And a lot of times I find that my students have a hard problem with this concept because they think, well, racism was resolved. The civil rights movement made racism illegal. It took away the discrimination in the law. Here's the problem. Racism is a system. It's systemic. It's everywhere. It's not an individual action. We've seen some individual actions, but in the history of St. Louis, it has become a part of our culture. It has become a part of our life, and discrimination happens on a daily basis if the color of your skin is not white. Okay, throw that in, I sound serious. I am serious. All right, brief history, and I'm already at half through my time, so I'm gonna be really fast. St. Louis was founded by slaveholders. We've had slavery since the foundation of 1764. St. Louis, we're in the 250th anniversary. First under the French, then under the Spanish. When the Americans acquired St. Louis in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, some people thought that they would actually abolish slavery because that's what they did with the Northwest Territory. They did not. They protected it. Slavery was protected within the Constitution. 1858 in St. Louis, Dred Scott decision established that black men are not citizens and that they have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. It's written into St. Louis history, it's written into our national history. But the time period in St. Louis that has the biggest relevance, I think, for us as a city and for understanding the whole metropolitan area, which, by the way, it's not just St. Louis, it's not just Ferguson. When people look at this area, the metropolitan area of St. Louis includes St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Franklin County, Jefferson County, St. Charles County, St. Clair County in Illinois, and Monroe County. We're all looked at as the same area. So I want to show you guys this map right here. This was published by Where We Stand, which is an organization that compares us to other cities all over the country. And this is a racially segregated map. St. Louis is the 6th most segregated city. And when we're talking about St. Louis, we're not just talking about downtown St. Louis, we're talking about this metropolitan area, including St. Charles County. The blue dots are white people. The green dots are everyone else. And Ferguson, do I have a little laser? Ferguson's right here in this green area, blue area. We are a primarily black city, but we haven't always been that way. The way that it got started was because of a decision in 1876. It was a separation of the city and county. It seemed innocuous at the time. It had to do with country residents, which were the wealthy St. Louisans, dictating taxes for everybody in the city, so they decided to make a separation, which you can see in this map. That black line that surrounds there, that's what's considered the city. Everything outside of that is county, right? So they made the decision to separate, but this is arguably one of the most important factors in creating segregation and racial discrimination in St. Louis. It goes back to 1876, right? So there's a long history of discrimination. We have the 1917 race riots. Those were caused by black Americans competing with white German immigrants for jobs, right? And there's long discrimination of black Americans being discriminated against. Here's the thing, guys. Black men and women were regularly paid less than white men and women. So it's economic discrimination as well, right? Just to put throw some numbers out there. The average median household income in St. Charles County, which by the way is primarily white, if we go back and look at this map, right? The average median income here is around $70,000. The average median income in Ferguson, which is 70% black currently, is $36,000. So we're talking about serious economic impacts, systemic racism, systemic discrimination that has long-term effects beyond just ordinary, everyday intermixings and dealings with the police. It also affects your ability to be economically successful because of that discrimination. So St. Louis discussed residential segregation in the 19-teens, right? And ultimately that law passed, but it was overturned by the federal government as being illegal. St. Louisans found a way around it with restrictive covenants, which is basically when you bought your house, you made an agreement not to sell it to black people. So even in Ferguson today, there are black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, right? Here's Ferguson in 1970. We can sort of trace this shift because of this separation of city and county and something that's called white flight. The economic base, the strong economic base of the city moves out to the county. So this is Ferguson in 1970. And the light blue is lower percentages of African Americans than the dark blue is 80% or more. So Ferguson is in that red, that's 1970, right? Here's 1990, and you can see that white area is moving further out in the county here. This is 2010. And in Ferguson here, you can see these darker blue areas and these lighter blue areas. There are white parts of Ferguson and black parts of Ferguson. So even within Ferguson, we are really segregated, right? And this is a serious problem. And this is where a lot of those racial tensions are coming from. I'm still running out of time. So what happened with Ferguson? Why this white flight, right? Ferguson was the fastest growing city from around a suburb of St. Louis from around 1930 until 1970. 1960, right? This is where most of the middle-class white people were moving from the city. And when they did that, they took their tax base, they took their schools, they took everything with them. So that can help explain some of the poverty in the inner city today, right? But in the 1970s, the manufacturing jobs that were based in Ferguson closed. So this included a Chevy plant, which moved to Kentucky. Right, that plant closed in 1987. It's not a coincidence that the 90s are a time of white flight. Guess where that plant, a new plant opened up by GM. Does anybody know where? Wentzville, around the same time. So it makes sense that you would see a pattern of migration out to this area in pursuit of the jobs. But there are long-term effects of that, and we have lots of evidence of racism that is associated with that. So Ferguson is now an economically depressed area, and there's other factors. The apartment complex where Mike Brown was killed, Camden Trace, I think is what it's called. Canfield, sorry. I live there, you would think I know that. Ironically, it is also one of the black areas, which even as a white resident of Ferguson, I'm noticing that in my own experience, I've been restricted to certain areas, and this isn't on a conscious decision on my part. And now I'm making a conscious decision to go into those areas and talk to those people and get to know them. But that apartment complex, a lot of the residents moved in there with St. Louis airport expansions in the 80s and 90s. So Lambert Airport basically destroyed 75% of Kinloch, which was a black city, and pushed those people into Ferguson. And what happens again is black people, because they've been discriminated against economically, are bringing in lower incomes. And that's driving the total wealth of Ferguson down, and it also leads to resentment. But one thing I would caution you, it's not because black people are inferior. It's because they've been racially discriminated against from getting those higher income jobs, from being in schools that don't have access to the same levels of education, right? So this is the context of Ferguson today. 1990, 25% black. 2010, 70% black. It is a very real, traceable shift and pattern that's happened, and it's associated with all levels of segregation and discrimination. And I think I'm going to have another discussion at some point in the future, because I've definitely gone over. So, next person.